I need to tell this exactly the way it happened, because I've spent 3 years trying to find a version of it that makes sense, and I still haven't found one. What I have found is that the longer you sit with something like this, the worse it gets, not better. The details don't fade the way bad memories are supposed to. They sharpen. So I'm going to tell it from the beginning, every piece of it, because the beginning matters more than I realized at the time. 3 years ago, I was renting a small house on a quiet street in a suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. It was a nice neighborhood. Trimmed lawns, families, kids riding bikes on weekends, neighbors who waved when you pulled into your driveway. The kind of place where the most dramatic thing that ever happened was someone's sprinkler system flooding the sidewalk. I had moved there because the rent was reasonable and I needed something close to my job. I worked nights at a logistics warehouse on the edge of the city, loading and sorting freight from around midnight until about 3:30 or 4 in the morning. My schedule was completely backwards from the rest of the world. While my neighbors were having dinner, I was getting ready for work. While they were waking up and making coffee, I was finally falling asleep. I lived alone in that house. No roommates, no pets, no real reason for anyone to come by unexpectedly. I liked it that way. I was 28 years old and I genuinely enjoyed the quiet. I had no idea how much I was going to start hating silence before any of this was over. It was the second week of October when I first noticed him. The leaves had started turning and there was that particular kind of cold in the air that only comes in early fall, sharp and clean and a little bit too still. I was getting home from my shift, pulling into my driveway the same way I had done almost every night for the past 8 months. I cut the engine, grabbed my jacket off the passenger seat, and as I looked up through the windshield, I saw a man standing on the sidewalk directly across the street from my house. Just standing there. He had no dog with him, no phone in his hand, no bag, nothing. His arms were at his sides. He was facing my house. It was 4:15 in the morning and the temperature was maybe 38 or 40 degrees outside. I noticed immediately that he wasn't hunched against the cold the way most people would be. He was standing perfectly straight, completely still, like the cold wasn't touching him at all. I sat in my car for a few seconds looking at him, and then I told myself he was probably waiting for an Uber or a ride from someone. People do strange things at 4 in the morning. I work at a warehouse in the middle of the night, so who am I to say what's normal? I went inside, locked the front door, and went to bed without thinking much more about it. The next night, he was there again. I pulled in around the same time and there he was, same spot on the sidewalk, same posture, same stillness. This time I sat in my car a little longer before going inside. I watched him for maybe a full minute. He didn't move. He didn't check his phone, didn't shift his weight from one foot to the other, didn't look up or down the street. He just stood there facing my house. I went inside and double-checked every lock before I went to sleep. By the end of that week I had seen him 6 times. Always between 4 and 4:30 in the morning. Always on the same stretch of sidewalk, in almost the exact same position, like he was standing on a spot he had chosen very deliberately. I started to feel genuinely unsettled, but I still kept making excuses for it in my head. Maybe he worked some kind of overnight shift nearby and this was just where he stood while he waited for his ride. Maybe he had insomnia and this was how he dealt with it. I know how that sounds now, but when you're tired and you want something to be explainable, you can talk yourself into almost anything. Around the start of the 3rd week, I began leaving my phone on the dashboard of my car every night when I pulled in, propped against the windshield and recording. I told myself it was just for documentation, just to have something concrete if I ever needed it. In truth, I think I was starting to understand that something was wrong and I wasn't ready to admit it yet. The footage was worse to watch than the real thing had been. I don't know exactly why, but seeing it on a small screen made it more disturbing than seeing it in person. In person you can tell yourself there's an explanation. On video, you just see what's actually there, which was a man standing completely motionless on a sidewalk at 4 in the morning, staring at my front door. I watched 3 clips back to back one evening before work and I didn't sleep well that day at all. I mentioned it to my co-worker Danny during our break one night. We'd worked together for about 2 years and I trusted him. I kept it casual, half laughing about it, the way you do when you want someone to tell you you're overreacting. Danny listened, nodded, and said maybe the guy was a sleepwalker. He said it seriously, not as a joke. He said sleepwalkers can wander pretty far from home and they don't really register what's around them, that. For about a day and a half I genuinely convinced myself that was the answer, that nearby there was a man with a sleepwalking condition who happened to end up on my street every few nights, standing in front of my house completely unaware of what he was doing. It was almost comforting, the sleepwalker explanation. And then on a Thursday night in late October I came home and he wasn't on the sidewalk. I noticed it immediately as I turned onto my street. The sidewalk across from my house was empty and I felt a small flood of relief. I pulled into my driveway, turned off the headlights, and sat there for a second just letting myself feel okay about it. And then I glanced in my rearview mirror. He was standing in my driveway. Not on the sidewalk, not across the street. In my driveway, maybe 15 feet behind my car, facing the house. His back was to me. He hadn't reacted at all to my headlights swinging across him when I pulled in. He was just standing there in my driveway, in the dark, staring at my house. I don't know exactly how long I sat there before I did anything. It felt like a long time. My hand found the door handle and I held onto it like it was keeping me steady. I kept thinking he would move, that he would hear me or sense me and walk away. He didn't move at all. I finally leaned on the horn. A long, loud blast that broke the silence of the whole street. A light came on in a neighbor's upstairs window. And he turned around. Not quickly. Not startled. He turned slowly, the way you turn when you have no reason to hurry, and he looked directly at me through the windshield. I couldn't see his face well in the dark, but I could see that he was looking straight at me. We stayed like that for what felt like several seconds and then he turned back around and walked away, down the street, into the dark, completely unhurried, like he had just been waiting for an appointment that was over now. I sat in my car for a long time after his shape disappeared into the darkness. Then I went inside and called the police. 2 officers came out. They were professional and they took it seriously, but I could hear in their questions where everything was heading. Had he threatened me in any way? No. Had he touched my property or my car? No. Had he said anything to me at any point? No. Had he done anything other than stand in public places and in my driveway? No. They told me that what I was describing, while understandably frightening, didn't give them much to work with in terms of charges or an arrest. Standing on a public sidewalk isn't a crime, they said. Being in someone's driveway is more of a gray area, but without a confrontation or a direct threat it was difficult to act on. They took a full report and said they would have patrol cars make extra passes through the neighborhood when they could. I said I understood. And I did understand. I just also understood that understanding something doesn't make it less frightening. That's the part I keep coming back to. He knew my schedule. He had never once been there when I wasn't coming home from work. He appeared between 4 and 4:30 in the morning, which is specifically and only when I came home from that job. He had figured out when I would be arriving, and he was there for me, not just standing on a street at random. I started changing things about my routine. I started parking 2 streets over and walking home through the backyards, which looking back was probably making me less safe, not more. I put a chair under my bedroom doorknob every night and kept a baseball bat beside my bed. I set up the dashcam phone every single night without fail. I told myself I was being careful and prepared, but mostly I was just afraid, and those were the only things I could think to do. For about 10 days after the driveway incident, nothing happened. He wasn't there when I came home. One night I even sat in my car for a few extra minutes, watching the street, and there was nothing. I started to breathe a little easier. I started to think maybe he had moved on, found someone else to fixate on, or maybe the police presence in the neighborhood had made him cautious. I was so relieved that I stopped parking 2 streets over. I stopped checking the rearview mirror quite so carefully. I told myself it was done. 3 weeks after the driveway incident, I came home and found my back door unlocked. I want to be specific about this because it matters. I always locked that door. I had been locking it religiously since the first week I noticed the man on the sidewalk. It was a habit so ingrained that I checked it before I left for work every single night without even thinking about it. It was locked when I left. When I came home it was unlocked. Not broken. Not damaged in any way. There was no sign of forced entry anywhere on the door or the frame. The lock itself was completely intact. It had simply been unlocked, quietly and cleanly, from the outside. I stood in my kitchen without moving or touching anything for a very long time. I kept looking around the room waiting to see something out of place that would tell me what had happened. My laptop was on the counter. Where I'd left it? My keys were on the hook by the door. My TV was visible through the doorway to the living room, still mounted on the wall. As far as I could tell, nothing had been taken. Nothing had been moved. The house looked exactly the way I had left it. Except for one thing. On the kitchen counter, in the small clear space between my coffee maker and the wall where I never left anything, there was a photograph. It was a printed photograph, not a screenshot or a phone image, but an actual print, the kind you get developed. I walked over to it slowly and I looked at it for a long time before I touched it. It was a photograph of me, asleep in my bed, taken from my bedroom doorway. You could see the outline of my body under the blanket, my face turned slightly to one side, the curtains drawn behind me on the window. I sleep with a fan running and blackout curtains, and I sleep deeply because of my schedule. I don't hear things during the day. Someone had come into my house, walked down my hallway, stood in my bedroom doorway, taken a photograph of me sleeping, and left. I don't know when it was taken. It could have been that morning. It could have been any morning in the past several weeks. There was no way to know. I did not sleep in that house again. I sat up for the rest of that night and into the next day with every light on and the baseball bat across my lap, and then I started making calls. I called my landlord and told him I was breaking the lease and that I would pay whatever penalty was required. I called Danny and asked if I could stay with him for a while without explaining much. I packed what I could carry in one trip: clothes, my laptop, my documents, my phone charger. I left the furniture. I left the kitchen equipment. I left things I had owned for years. I just needed to not be in that house anymore, and I was past caring about anything else. I stayed with Danny for just over 2 months. I found a new place in a different part of the city with a security camera over the front door, a camera at the back, and a deadbolt on every door that I changed the locks on myself the day I moved in, before I unpacked a single bag. I never saw the man again. Not once, not on my new street, not anywhere in the city that I recognized. The police investigation, such as it was, went nowhere. There were no fingerprints on the photograph. There was no sign of how anyone had gotten through that back door. There were no suspects, no leads, no matches in any database. The case is technically still open. I called to check once, about a year later. The officer I spoke to was kind about it, but there was nothing to report. Some cases just don't get solved. I know that. I've made peace with most of it. What I haven't made peace with is the footage. About 6 months after I moved, I was going through the old dashcam recordings on my phone late one night, watching them the way you watch something you know is bad for you but can't stop returning to. I had watched most of them many times before, looking for anything I might have missed, any detail I hadn't noticed in the moment. I got to the last recording, the one from the night before I found the photograph, and I watched it the way I always did. He's standing in his spot. Same stillness, same silence. The footage runs for about a minute and a half, and for most of it nothing happens, just the image of him standing there in the dark at the edge of my headlights. And then the recording is almost over. My headlights start to swing away from him as I angle the car into the driveway. The frame starts to go dark, the way it always does in the last 2 seconds before I cut the engine and the recording ends. I had watched this clip at least a dozen times. But that night I had my headphones in, and the volume was turned all the way up for the first time. In the 2 seconds of darkness at the very end of the recording, just before the clip cuts off completely, you can hear something. It is quiet. It is almost swallowed by the ambient sound of the engine and the night air. But it is there. He says my name. Not loudly. Not in any way that sounds threatening or distorted. He says it quietly and clearly, the way you would say hello to a neighbor you had known for a long time, like someone greeting a friend. I have listened to that clip hundreds of times since then. I have had other people listen to it, people I trust, and they hear it too. My name, spoken once, in the dark, by someone who was standing on a sidewalk across the street while I was still inside my car with the windows up. I don't know how he knew it. I don't know how he could have said it loud enough for the phone to pick up from that distance, through glass, over the sound of the engine. I don't know any of it. I just keep the clip saved in a folder on my phone that I open less and less often now, but never delete, because it is the only proof I have that any of it actually happened, and some part of me is still not ready to let go of that.